Good Monday morning, everybody. It's time for episode 3 of some stops along the way. We're going to unpack some more of my experiences in Russia this morning, as well as get into some of the history and some of the geopolitical issues that are in play in Russia in the region today. Going to have just a quick sip of coffee here. It's early in the morning. We're going to get started. Glad you're with us. Hope you've learned something from the last 2 episodes, and just as kind of a bridge from episode 2, which talked about my first trip to Russia in the late 1990s. I mentioned during that video a song called Evening Bells. It's something that has been really interesting for me to think about over the years and to reminisce on, because it was a song that really resonated with me. And I thought I would share it with you this morning. This is in Russian, so unless you speak Russian, you're not going to really understand the words. But I encourage you to go online and read the story of the song Evening Bells, and to enjoy the beautiful melody with me. There's so much cultural significance to the arts all throughout that region. And I think Evening Bells is a microcosm of a very beautiful work of poetry that has been put to music. And in addition, it means a lot to me because it brings back good memories of my first trip to Russia before things went somewhat sideways later on, as we'll talk more about. But here it is. This is sung by a Cossack choir and Ivan Rebrov, and I hope you enjoy it. Just take about 3 minutes and 30 seconds or so to chill out and enjoy the beautiful melody of the song.
a brilliant woman.
Sorry about that. Got a little ahead of myself. Wow, that is so powerful. And it does bring back a lot of memories for me of that night in Krasnodar, listening to Josip Kapbon. But it also brings some sadness to me as well. It's hard to explain, really, because I had subsequent trips to Russia during the late 1990s and early 2000s, and I'll talk about those that were very productive. I was back in the period when we believed there was hope that Russia would join Western Europe and the United States in promulgating the democratic values that we all hold dear. That didn't happen. There are a lot of reasons it didn't happen. But what's occurred in the years since then, and I haven't worked in Russia now in many years, and will not work or travel to Russia again until the political situation there changes. Not out of security reasons, but because I do not support the policies of this current government. But we really need to understand a little bit about Russia's history in order to determine how we got to this point. I've got a few notes here. I just want to share some things with you. When Russia's current president, Vladimir Putin, began his stepping stone strategy of taking back territory in the name of, quote unquote, protecting Russian citizens that lived within those territories. And this is Abkhazia in Georgia, Ossetia, Crimea, others. When he began this strategy, the momentum began to build and the thought process began to matriculate until finally he more or less articulated his goal in the days after the illegal and full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 22nd, 2022. And his vision, and I'm not making this up, he more or less said this in his own words, is not to restore the Soviet Union. That's a fallacy. You hear several pundits talking about the fact that Putin wants to restore the Soviet Union. He's never said that, and that's not the case. Those of us that have worked in Russia and extensively study Russia know that's not the case. What he's talking about is actually worse than that. It's actually scarier than that. He's talking about the reconstitution of the Russian Empire. Now think about this. If you know anything about the Soviet Union, you more or less know the countries that were involved or that made up the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. But listen to the names of the countries that encapsulated the Russian Empire at its peak. Of course, you had Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Lithuania, Georgia, Estonia, Belarus, Armenia, Latvia, Moldova, even the Duchy of Finland, which is now the country of Finland, of course, and even parts of Poland. If the end game is to restore the Russian Empire, or even part of the Russian Empire, this is something that is of extreme concern, not just to Europe, but to the world. When you also look at how Russia's political ecosystem has evolved, beginning with all the way back to the 900s, with the monarchs ruling portions of what is now Russia, all the way up to the period that I really want to talk about for just a moment, and that's the period of the czars, which began roughly in 1530 and lasted through 1917. During most of that period, one family ruled the Russian Empire. From 1613 to 1917, the Romanovs were the czars of Russia. And we all know what happened to the Romanovs with the rise of the Bolsheviks in 1917. Of course, they were deposed. And then on July 16th, 1918, the Romanovs were murdered, and the age of the czars officially ended. And that became the foundation stone for what became the USSR. And that expanded into a lot of satellite states that were ruled by supporters of the USSR, and of course that became the Soviet bloc, which began to unwind in 1989. So when you look at that history and you see the pride and the populism and the nationalism that were part of Russia's history, that were endemic to its political fabric, then it's not hard to see how we got to where we are now. I even saw the seeds of this in the late 1990s and early 2000s during my subsequent trips to Russia. I remember a cold day during one of my subsequent trips when Valerie, who I introduced you to during the last episode, my interpreter at the time. In fact, she was my interpreter for most of my work in Russia during that period. I remember a day that we were standing in Red Square in front of the GUM department store. If any of you have been to Moscow, you can't miss the GUM department store. As you enter Red Square from the major boulevard, it's right on your left. It's a yellowish colored building that used to be apartments for Soviet officials, but then became the first international shopping center with all the big brands in Moscow. Since there are many more, but GUM was the first, and probably, and still in my mind, one of the most famous vestiges of the New Order in Russia in the late 1980s, early 1990s. But I remember standing with Valerie looking in the windows of that department store. And she was pretty pensive that morning, I remember. And she sighed heavily as she looked at all of these brands displayed in the window. And she said, "Mr. Mark, tell me something." I said, "Okay." She said, "You know, when the former regime was here, meaning the Soviets or the communists, we had a little bit of money, but there was really nothing to buy. You stand in line for everything. Maybe it was a lemon this time that you would get, or maybe a piece of meat, or maybe a some fresh vegetables. But we had just a little money to scrape together. And now, look in these windows. Just look. What do you see? You see all of these international brands. You see everything that we want, that we've thought about, that we've seen in magazines, that our American quote unquote enemies had that we didn't have. And now we have no money. So we can look at these things, but this is more like a museum than a shopping center, because most Russians don't have the money to buy these things. So she looked at me and she said, which is worse? Having a little bit of money and nothing to buy, or seeing all these things to buy and having no money? It was really the unanswerable question. And it was there that I really saw the first seeds of the mindset of the average Russian. This was several years then removed from the change in political and economic system. Moscow and other major cities in Russia were modernizing. They were putting in infrastructure. While I was there on one of the trips, they put in the first drive-through McDonald's, and they had to post somebody out in the drive-through to show people what to do because they'd never seen a drive-through before. Valerie and I stood in a long line one night to get into the first McDonald's that opened in Moscow. And it was tantamount to joy for the Russians to go there. So all of this was happening. And yet, under the surface, it also exposed the fallacy of the Soviet system. It exposed the former leadership. It exposed the way of life that the Russians had been told was the most acceptable way of life. It embarrassed them. It was a time when, after several years removed from the changing government, that reality set in. That Russia was on the verge of no longer being seen as a world power, but as a donor nation that needed to be fixed. And that was unacceptable almost uniformly to the Russian population, which raised questions like the one that Valerie asked. A little bit later in that same trip, she told me something else that was indicative of the Russian mindset and laid the foundation, I think, for what was to come. We were walking one day in the city of Samara, Russia, down on the Volga River in the south part of the country. And Valerie said, you know the difference between Russians and Americans? I said, well, there are many, but you have something to say, so go ahead and tell me, what's the difference? And she said, well, when an American sees someone who is prosperous, who has a good job, and makes a good income, and has all the things that they need, the American wants to be like that person. She said, that's what you call the American dream, right? that you can be successful. You can be like that person or those people who have the things that you want. If you work hard, there's a pathway to achieve that. But when a Russian sees someone who has money, has all the things that they want, has status, has influence, rather than wanting to be them, the Russian thinks, what did they steal from me to get where they are? That was a window into the Russian mindset. And realizing that this is no criticism of the Russians, because they came out of literally thousands of years of a system that went from a monarchy into feudalism, and then back to monarchy, and then to the czars, and then to the Bolsheviks. They came out of thousands of years of a system that created a nationalistic philosophy where they focused on their strength and their position in the world, even at the expense of their own people. And even the poorest Russians, when I talked to them on that trip, they would talk about the times when they had a little, and when they were living a better life under the former system than they were under this new capitalistic system that they didn't understand, because under that system there were winners and there were losers in their mind. Under the former system, there were still winners and losers, but it wasn't as pronounced. And everybody had something. In those days, the retirees, they had their pensions. The state guaranteed them. When the government changed in the late 90s, in the late 80s, early 90s, that was no longer the case. They even lost their pensions. And so, especially the elderly, by the late 90s, were quite upset. They were quite concerned about their place in the world. And then you look at the younger Russians at that time. They were seeing all of these things that they could buy, all these things that were what they wanted, from the expensive sunglasses to the designer jeans to the fur coats and hats and boots. And yet they had no money, no jobs, no pathway really to get to them. And they would look around and they would see what they called at that time the new Russians. Now we would probably call them the wealthy Russians or even oligarchs. But then they were the new Russians who had the Mercedes and the Land Cruisers, the Land Rovers, the Bugattis, the Maseratis, the expensive clothing, the trips all over the world. And a large swath of the population was left out of that. I remember during one of those trips traveling out to the far east of Russia, 11 time zones from Moscow to Vladivostok, which was under the Soviets a closed city because it was the home of the Russian Pacific Fleet. But it was open by then, and I was able to go to Vladivostok. It was very uncommon for Americans to go there at that time. I had the opportunity to speak at the university, talk to a lot of Russian university students, talk to a lot of business leaders, talk to the mayor. And a good friend of mine there, Marina, who had lived her life in Vladivostok, made a statement one night over dinner that once again was very indicative of the mindset. We were talking about the Russian economy, which was very poor at that time. And she said, Mark, you know, this experiment with capitalism and democracy, that's kind of interesting. And we've appreciated everything that's been done for us. But listen to what she said. If you don't hear anything else in this podcast, listen to this. But, she said, we're at the bottom of the economic spectrum. We're embarrassed. We need a strong man to take charge and to restore our honor. I'll repeat that. She said we need a strong man to take charge and restore our honor. That was in the waning days of the former regime before Vladimir Putin came onto the scene. Former KGB officer who, of course, became president and remains president of Russia. Certainly Boris Yeltsin wasn't the kind of leader they were looking for, who stepped in onto the stage after the change in government facilitated during the Gorbachev, Reagan, Thatcher years in the late 1980s. Putin was the strong man. He was who they were looking for to restore the honor of Russia. And like it or not, in his own way, mostly misguided, he did that. You go to Russia today, it's nothing like the Russia I remember when I was working there. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to go to a good restaurant in Moscow and not spend close to $100 a person on a meal. There aren't big lines at McDonald's anymore. There aren't as many people standing outside of the GUM department store and other beautiful shopping centers in Moscow and looking at them like a museum. They've got money in their pockets. They're buying the things that they need. Certainly, they've still got economic issues. Certainly, there are a lot of disenfranchised people. But they now have seen the confluence of the capitalistic mentality with the mindset of nationalism and this yearning for Russia to be a huge player on the world stage again. That trip I made to Russia in the early 2000s, where I went out to the Far East, and I was in Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, and then in the center of the country in Irkutsk. And I went in the wintertime, which I guess makes me crazy because it's Siberia. It was very cold. Met a lot of great people. But that trip really reinforced in me the dichotomy, if you will, this friction between a new political order and the mindset of the Russian people. When I arrived in Vladivostok, I spent a great deal of time with the business leaders there, and the mayor and others. It was a very interesting trip because there were just so many fascinating things that occurred. I mean, I was literally standing in the city that had been closed for so many years, the home of the Russian Pacific Fleet, where probably more U.S. missiles had been aimed than any place other than Moscow. I spoke at the university, as I said before, interacted with the city leaders. And I remember sitting with the mayor one night. And the mayor's friend, someone who was sitting with him, began talking about the old days. And Valerie was interpreting for me. And he said, you know, you look back at the Soviet Union and the leaders during that time. Stalin, the strong man, he's gone. Khrushchev, gone. Brezhnev, gone. Andropov, gone. Others in succession, leading to Gorbachev, all gone. He said, Khrushchev, I was a young man, a poet in Moscow. I wrote the wrong thing, or at least the wrong thing according to Khrushchev, and he sent me out here to work in the Gulag. Now Khrushchev and all these other people are gone. I'm still here. They sent me away from my family that I never saw again. They sent me away from my life. They put me to work at forced labor. And they did that to punish me for having thoughts and ideas they didn't like. But now they're all gone and I'm still here. So I got the last laugh. But then he said, along with the mayor, something that, again, was indicative of the mindset. We don't miss the Soviets, they said. We don't miss them. We're here because of them, but we've built our life and we've built our leadership. And we're in powerful positions. What we miss is the strength of our country. We need to be strong again. Really, really a telling situation. You can read more about that period of time in my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, which will be available on Amazon beginning on June the 2nd. But all through that particular trip, going to Khabarovsk, which is also a city in the Far East, and then Irkutsk, which is in the middle of Siberia, on the banks of the world's deepest lake, Lake Baikal. One day we were driving on what I thought was a road and found out later that we were driving across Lake Baikal because it was frozen over. When I arrived in Irkutsk to begin the assignment there, it was minus 17 Celsius when I arrived and just kept getting colder. Sitting here doing this podcast, I can look across my office at a photo of Val and I in our fur coats and hats standing in the park in Irkutsk during that very, very freezing winter that we were there. But all during this time, I saw the changes began to happen. From that first trip in 1997 throughout 98, 99, into the early 2000s when I worked there, I saw the progression of what was happening in that society. And of course, it was in the early part of the 2000s when USAID, who had provided so much support to Russia once the government had changed, and other NGOs who were Western oriented, other donors who were Western oriented, were essentially kicked out of the country. And the oil fields, which had been largely repaired by Western countries in Europe and the United States, were once again taken back by the Russians, and this led to the rise of the oligarchs, largely in the areas of critical minerals and oil and gas production. Russia began a new phase in its development, a phase that led it from the dark days when the government changed, when they were exposed to the world for the failure of the Soviet system, to what they are now, which again is a global superpower that was built on an ideology of nationalism. I would be remiss if I didn't fast forward just a little bit and talk about February 22nd, 2022. I was sitting in my office in Tbilisi, which is the capital of the Republic of Georgia, watching in horror as this invasion by the Russians of Ukraine occurred. Reaching out to my friends in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Lviv, Mariupol, hearing in real time what was happening, watching the mighty Russian army move closer and closer and closer to Kyiv. And in addition to just the horrifying scene that was unrolling before my computer screen, I couldn't get away from the remembrance of all these conversations that I had had, and the mindset that led to the war in Abkhazia in Georgia, the annexation of Ossetia in Georgia, the 2014 Crimean War, where Crimea was taken back from Ukraine. In Georgia alone, Russia took back 20% of the country. They occupied 20% of a sovereign country. Did the same thing in Crimea. And the seeds of this were being sown during the time that I was doing projects there. And I think I was too early in my career at that time to really understand the forces that were at play, or how these seeds would grow into what would become this amalgamation of forces that would extol the discussion of the rejuvenation of the Russian Empire. I do understand it now, but I didn't understand it then. And I'm not a Russian expert. I haven't spent my career, as many others have, studying Russia. What I can tell you is what I've observed and the real conversations that I've had with Russian people and my friends, and regrettably some former friends there. And when I take all that body of information and I look at it and I spend some time analyzing it, I can see the building blocks that occurred to get us to where we are today. I wish I could say that all of the friends that I made during those trips are still in my network, but regrettably they're not. Not because I didn't want them to be, but because they chose not to be. My stance on Ukraine from day one has been very clear. That the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal and that it's tantamount, what's happening there is tantamount to genocide. And that has caused some of my Russian friends to sever their connections with me. And that makes me sad. But at the end of the day, geopolitics aside, I had to make a determination in my business and how I was going to address this issue. And the way I chose to address it is assisting the Ukrainians as much as possible to navigate through this very challenging time in their history, and to determine not to work in Russia again in any capacity until changes occur that will alter the trajectory of their sole focus on restoring the Russian Empire. I don't know whether that'll ever happen in my lifetime. I may never go back to Russia. But I will always have the memories of when I worked there and of the people I've met. You can read a lot more about them in the book, but suffice it to say, I wouldn't trade that period for anything because I learned a great deal. And in some ways, it was that work that I did in those early days that cemented my passion for international development. And so every project I did from there forward, and the decision that Debbie, Daniel, and I made to leave our life in the United States, for me to resign as president of the Colorado Springs Chamber of Commerce, and to travel to Romania to run a economic growth project that we thought would be 3 years in duration, but was the first foundation stone of a career of 23 years on the road. The seeds of that, the passion for that, it all came from those early trips to Russia. And so in some ways, I'll always look back with fondness. But regrettably, it'll always also be tempered with sadness as to what could have been. I mean, think about it. Can you imagine a world order where two of the largest and most powerful countries in the world work together to promote peace and democracy and good governance. Can you imagine that? What would the world look like if the Russian government and Russian people had decided that globalism was more important than nationalism? That those lessons that they learned under the Soviets and in that very difficult transition period to a more democratic way of thinking could be used to better the world instead of just those who benefit from it in Russia. I know it's naive, and I've been in this business too long. I spent 40 years in the economic development business, 25 of that in the international development business, and so I know that's naive. I know that obviously it'll never happen. But think if it did. As John Lennon said, imagine. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Wow. That's something to think about, and something to dream about, and something to hope for. But I don't want to end this on a negative note. Because of all the things that I think I know, there's a whole lot that I don't know. There were decisions made all along the spectrum of Russian leadership that led to this point that I'm not privy to, and that very well could have altered the scenario that I outlined for you today. All I can tell you is what, as I said before, what I saw, what I observed, the conversations I had, and the view of where we are now. So that's what Some Stops Along the Way is all about. Really. It's not about just making the perfect podcast, because we already know this is not the perfect podcast. And I'm not the perfect host. This is about having real conversations. This is about understanding some things that need to be understood, and expanding our worldview to realize that nothing is ever as good as we think it is, and nothing is ever as bad as we think it is. And that for all the angst and the conflict and the partisan approaches and the nationalism, there is a large contingent of people in Russia, throughout Eastern Central Europe, Western Europe, the United States, other areas of the world, who do want to act globally, who do want to be citizens of the world, not turning their backs on their own country, not in any way being ashamed of their country, being proud of their country, but also understanding that every country is like a puzzle piece in an overall picture of the world order. So, we've unpacked a lot about Russia over these last two episodes. It's a country that's in flux right now. It's a country that's really, in my mind, lost its way. Whether or not it will ever find it again remains to be seen. But we also must realize that in the minds of a great majority of Russians, and certainly their government, there's nothing to fix. They fixed the problem. And they're not the issue. Everyone else is the issue. So there are two sides to every coin. But I wanted to unpack this and have some real talk, because we're going to go from here to some other countries where I've worked, and we're going to take a pretty fascinating journey throughout Europe and Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, to Africa, to South America, to Oceania. It's going to be a very interesting and entertaining journey, tracking along with the experiences that I've had over my 40-year career. But it all started with these projects in Russia, and that's why I wanted to start here. So, go online, look at the lyrics to Evening Bells if you're interested. Maybe listen to it again. Listen to that beautiful melody. I'm going to infuse music and culture into most of these videos because it's so rich out there, and whether or not you're ever able to visit these countries, hopefully you'll come away learning a little bit more about their arts, their culture, their people, etc. So, until next time, this is Mark McCord, unpacking some stops along the way. Take care, and blessings to all of you.